How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the Headwaters Science Center live stream. I'm Carl, and today I'm going to be talking about mammoths because we have a lot of snow outside. Headwaters Science Center is open 9:30 to 5, 6 days a week, and on Sundays we're open 1 to 5. So on the table in front of me, I've got a little bit of fun stuff, and we'll get into that in a little bit. First, I'm just going to do how I normally go over recently with the dinosaurs. We're going to go over the mammoth. So they are obviously Kingdom Animalia, Phylum Chordata, and class Mammalia. They are in the order Proboscideae, which is the same family as elephants, or order as elephants. They are in the family Elephantidae, the subfamily Elephantinae, and in the tribe Elephantini. Now, mammoth's genus is Mammuthus. So, contrary to popular belief, mammoths aren't ancestors of elephants from the Ice Age. They are a very closely related, very similar animal to elephants. In fact, the closest living relative of mammoths today are elephants, who actually aren't that closely related to African elephants, given research. So, with elephants or not, no, they are not elephants. There's a few differences. So, one of the first differences is mammoths very frequently had smaller ears, were frequently covered in hair, and could be a little bit larger than elephants in some cases. In some cases, a lot larger. So, mammoths, there were about 11 species of total throughout the time they were on Earth. They ranged in time from 5 million years ago to just about 4,000 to 3,700 years ago. We're still doing research on that. It's a bit unclear, but that's very recently. For a frame of reference, in that time frame, mammoths would have still been on Earth when the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, which is really recently for some of the animals that we're covering on the little prehistoric animal live stream. And they were found from Africa into Asia, Europe, and all the way to North America. And they were generally large. The largest mammoth species was the steppe mammoth, and the steppe mammoth was 13 feet tall at the shoulder, over 8 tons. Pretty heavy. Although the smallest mammoth were a type of Pygmy Mammoth, which were only about 4.5 to 7 feet tall at the shoulder, and probably only weighed about a ton, which sounds like a lot of weight. They put it in contrast with those other. And they were grass-eating herbivores. They were grazers for the most part. And you can see that with their teeth. Their teeth are really just made for kind of grinding up and crushing and doing a bit of processing on that grass. I mean, show you these teeth there. They have these ridged teeth. Very similar to elephants today. So they probably didn't just eat grass, but grass would have been a huge part of their diet. And then also they had very large tusks often. We have a piece of mammoth tusk right here. And people still find mammoth ivory to this day. You'll find it a lot in Siberia. It's actually being used as an alternative to like elephant or walrus ivory, which you wouldn't really think, but mammoth ivory does help with conservation a little bit. Admittedly, it does hurt the scientific efforts to understand animals as we're selling parts of these animals as trinkets. And they are what we would call megafauna, which are excessively large wildlife. Megafauna, a lot of people tend to talk about it like it's totally gone, but megafauna still exists in animals like bison in North America today, elephants, rhinos in other parts of the world like Africa. And it really is kind of a looser category, just very large wildlife.
Is the term more exclusive?
It typically does, but not entirely, given certain other animals that I think get lumped in with megafauna, like those terror birds from South America. And kind of a fun thing, so the mammoths that I have drawn behind me are mainland, what we would call the woolly mammoth, which is Mammuthus primigenus, and then the Wrangel Island woolly mammoth, which is the exact same species, just a subspecies. The Wrangel Island mammoths were the last mammoths on Earth, being only about the size of a large cow, and they lived up on an island in Siberia. What happened to them, if you guys remember last live stream I did on titanosaurs, These mammoths living on an island were subject to what we went over last week, which is Foster's rule, which is large animals, when they find themselves in isolated habitats like islands, tend to be go towards smaller size. The other thing that happened with these woolly mammoths, though, is what we think is called a mutational meltdown, which is when, through low population and the normal mutation rate with cell division and DNA replication, unhealthy mutations build up, and in some cases become fixed in the population, where the gene that has something wrong with it is the only gene present. These mammoths' population was never that high, which meant they were always vulnerable to it, and eventually their population got too low to sustain itself. Generally, the minimum population to sustain itself is about 500. The minimum population to sustain itself without undergoing mutational meltdown is typically estimated at around 1,000. The population of these mammoths numbered lower than 500 on an island, probably. A very small island. Probably could not sustain many of these, because even though they're the size of a cow, still a very large-bodied animal that takes a lot of food to run. They have found some really well-preserved mammoths, though. Not just the Wrangel Island ones, but also woolly mammoths, Colombian mammoths. I'm from California, and we have the La Brea tar pits. We have a lot of good preserved mammoth skeletons in the La Brea tar pits. It really gives us a good, clear picture of their anatomy. Those skeletons are mostly complete. Woolly mammoths, they actually every now and then do pull frozen woolly mammoths out of the permafrost. We know everything from like hair color on these animals to where the hair covered, and they had a range of different hair color, actually. Mammoths could be almost black in color to almost blonde, everything in between. They're beautiful animals as well, and mammoths were quite important to our ancestors. In the Neolithic, being this was a very widely ranging animal, people in North America, Europe, Asia, all would have been hunting mammoths every now and then. They also are very common in art, as we went over in the cave art live stream. And they, much like large, very interesting looking animals today, they captured the human imagination. Let's see. So the woolly mammoth also is not the largest species of mammoth, as we went over. They're probably still the most well-known just because they had so much hair on them, and we don't have an animal like that today. It's most people, it's big hairy elephant, and that's not a common sight today. Not all mammoths are super hairy, though. The Colombian mammoth from North America was relatively hairless, actually. Lived in a little bit warmer climate during the Ice Age. Led to them being more like an Asian elephant, where they had that very thin, sparse coat of hair. But the woolly mammoth was also probably one of the more distributed species, living on 3 continents, which is really impressive. Let's see. What else do we... So why are mammoths gone is actually a good question. So this is something... typically what gets blamed is us, but that's not really always what I have heard. Recently, they've been looking at how the ecology in the Americas and Eurasia changed at the end of the last ice age. And what happened was the ecosystem shifted from mostly open tundra-like grasslands and steppe to more boreal forests, which I'm sure everyone from Minnesota, northern Canada, all the way up into parts of Alaska, we live in a lot of boreal habitat, and that habitat didn't exist when the mammoths were around. And mammoths are not really well adjusted to boreal coniferous forests. Mastodon were, and we can go over mastodon on another day, perhaps. But the mammoth's teeth were not meant for eating that coniferous vegetation that much. So they lost out on their habitat, and when the habitat to support these large animals disappears, typically those animals also do tend to disappear. So another question about the mammoths I do want to get to really quick that I've heard a lot is, why do they have such large tusks? With proboscideans, a lot of them did tend to have different tusks. That's actually one of the ways they've differentiated stuff like gomphotheres, mastodons, elephants, and all from each other. One of the hypotheses for mammoths was that they used these really large tusks kind of for digging through snow to get down to like grass during the winter, which may be true, given that we don't have a lot of the other sort of elephantid Elephantidae animals that were really going in winter, and those tusks that kind of curl at the end might have been useful for kind of sweeping away large areas of snow. But we don't know for sure yet. The tusks may have been something for sexual selection, where big tusks on a male were really impressive. But until we get a time machine, we'll never be able to fully know this behavioral stuff with animals, and it is just a part of paleontology. It is a partially speculative field. Do you guys have any questions or anything you want to add about the mammoths? Because this is kind of a looser.
One, you talked about Foster's rule before, right?
Yeah, on titanosaurs, where typically large animals that move into like an island tend to get smaller.
But it goes the other way too, where small stuff gets big on islands. Island gigantism is a thing. It's not not a one-way street.
Yep, and we did it. We have a few animals we can go over that with too. There's a giant I think it's like a hamster in the Mediterranean that was on an island. It was like big. Yeah. Like you think of hamsters like that, it goes on the island, doesn't have enough natural predators, and suddenly it's big and beefy. I think the kiwi or some of the moa is another good Foster's rule.
Yeah, a lot of the big island bird things get island isolated and get real big too. It's Foster's rule goes both directions. It homogenizes towards the middle rather than
just getting small or getting giant. But yeah, mammoths are really an animal that I think still capture a lot of imagination. I think as a kid I was obsessed with these things. I even have a little miniature here. They show up all the time. I think like Game of Thrones even had mammoths on. But again, the cool thing about mammoths is they are a prehistoric animal that you have so much understanding. They're working on sequencing their DNA from those preserved specimens in permafrost.
Yeah, they're interesting because they're recent enough that, like I said, doing stuff like that is feasible in a way that it's not with dinosaurs.
Yeah, it's the fact that like the mammoth, it's within our species' existence that this animal was around. And it's so recent that, like, you'll notice I've not referred to these as fossils. They're not fossils in most cases. These are actually the biological material of the animal, not the lithified or otherwise geologic traces of them.
I think the official designation for fossils, it has to be 10,000 years old, which...
Really? Yeah. I mean, even like with the mammoths, though, like again, the Wrangel Island mammoths then are not fossils. They're actually just bones. And it's the thing with stuff that's that recent. It's just interesting. And it's the mammoths are the animal that you always hear someone on some newspaper every couple of years. We're 5 to 10 years away from bringing back the mammoths, which I've always been somewhat amused at, just because, as we talked about, the environment these animals lived in has disappeared. It's sort of a sad thing where if we brought them back, we'd be bringing them back and we'd have nowhere to put them. But they are something where I think for this winter I might switch from dinosaurs to talking about Ice Age megafauna and stuff, because they are interesting and they don't often get talked about. The other thing with mammoths that I do like is, given their similarity to elephants, we can infer a lot about their behavior. They very likely have a social structure very similar to elephants, living in matriarchal herds of mostly females, and then the males living mostly separate. They probably took care of their young and the other members of the herd. And their navigation, they're probably much like elephants, led by a matriarch. And they learned that path over years and years. These animals probably lived a long time individually. And they're just, as someone who likes elephants a lot, it's really cool to have something that's so similar, but still just a little bit different.
I think that's part of the mystique, too, is it's so easy to project things that you know about elephants onto them.
Yeah, I mean,
in a way that, like I said, with something like a dinosaur, you can't really do this.
There's
almost like too much mystery with the dinosaurs for it to be... It
really
loses some of the mystique in the lack of information and lack of accessible information.
I mean, mammoths were also an animal that, for a long time, weren't necessarily thought to be extinct, actually. I think, Ryan, you've told me about the whole thing that Thomas Jefferson was, like, super pumped about potentially finding mammoths after the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah. A big part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, on kind of part that's been forgotten at time, but one of the primary motivations for it was Thomas Jefferson was hoping to discover mammoths in the western United States still alive,
which is just hilarious. But it is the thing; these animals live so recently. Like there's oftentimes debates over certain depictions in art in certain parts of the world are mammoth, because there's like I think there's a bit of art in Egypt that maybe of a pygmy mammoth is always debated. Um, and then there's always the thing of just like how recently were stuff alive. I personally don't that recent. I think 4,000 years ago is probably pretty solid.
But even that, even if it's 4 or 5,000 years ago, that's like, yeah, that's like human writing exists.
Yeah, like, it's just shockingly close when you think of an extinct animal, or it's something that was discovered relatively recently. It's just they're really interesting animals. It's the fact that it's something from the Ice Age basically got to the modern time. There's something about that that's interesting. It's why the focus of so many like novels and stuff is something from prehistory somehow survived into the present. It's a concept that I think is so curious to humans. And then mammoths are just cool. Big tusks, hairy, snuffleupagus. You know, there's so many weird depictions. They work their way into so much media, video games, movies, cartoons, comics, documentaries. I think like one of the best episodes that the BBC, like Walking with Dinosaurs and Walking with Monsters, did was on mammoths, and it was a very well done one. And just because we have so much biological information, we know what they ate, we know where they lived, we know how big they got, we know how we acted with them to a degree. It's so easy to take that animal and put it front and center that you can't do with a lot of these other, even prehistoric animals from the Ice Age. You know, you don't often see Irish elk stuff, or the giant ground sloth, or the cave bears in movies and stuff, because we don't have as much left of them. We don't have as much to draw parallels to on some of those animals, like the giant sloths. They're just so different than anything alive today. It's hard to slide them into something that people will understand, whereas the mammoth, it clicks right away. But yeah, no, thank you for tuning in. I know this is a relatively short live stream, kind of a less directly focused one, but it was kind of one that came up with this morning based on all the snow outside. A wonderful rest of your